Welcome, everyone. My name's Megan Laughlin. I'm Director of Special Programs for the School of Dramatic Arts. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. We're very happy to have you here. This is our second event associated with our production of Angels in America Millennium Approaches. The cast is sitting right here in the front row. Great to have you. We're very fortunate to do this event in the theater on the set. This is obviously a non-performance night. I would like to plug, we just added a performance for this Sunday evening, and that is the only performance you can get tickets. The others are sold out, so if you haven't seen it yet, please do. You can secure tickets from the USC box office. I saw it last week. It's amazing. You and the crew have done an amazing job. So I want to get right to the event tonight. I'm going to turn it over to Professor Tony Taccone, who we owe a huge gratitude and thanks. He has really led the charge with this show and also helped me putting all these events together. Thank you.
Thank you, Megan. Hey. Great to see everybody. Thanks for coming out tonight. I know there's a million things that are going on, as always, and it's hard to parse out which ones you're actually going to get to. So I wanted to give you guys a little bit of a context for the conversation you're about to participate in. I met Oskar Eustis 46 years ago, and he walked into a little theater that I was working in Berkeley, California. He was 20 years old, full of spit and vinegar, looking good and feeling good. And we fell into a conversation. It was probably about 3 or 4 hours, as I recall. And in that conversation, there's only a few conversations in your life that you can look back on and say, that conversation changed my life. That was one. So we fell into this conversation about life and art and politics and change. And within the conversation, you could tell we were aligned. There was some kind of synchronicity, some kind of vibe. And Oskar was, at that time, living in Germany and looking to come back to the United States. He'd spent his Wunderkind years in Germany running a theater called Red Wing, which was named after his hometown in Minnesota, in the upper reaches of Minnesota, where we gather every year to get really drunk. And Oskar returned, and I like to think that our conversation was part of his decision to come back and live in the San Francisco Bay Area. We found ourselves at the Eureka Theater in San Francisco, where we worked together for 8 years. And those were formative years. They're the years where you're figuring out just who you are, and you're so full of arrogance that you are sure that life is going to turn out just like you wanted. And so we spent the best part of our youth there, during which time we started doing the best of the Brits and the best of the German theater and the best of the Italian theater. And at a seminal moment, which I won't go into now because it's the basis of another long story, which is a great story, but we won't tell it now. We looked at each other and said, it's time to find American writers who we can work with to shape a body of work that we feel will directly affect our experience, be in dialogue with our community and our world about what might be possible to envision. And it was during the course of that time that Oskar was dispatched because a friend of his had known about this kid called Tony Kushner. Oskar went to New York, came back with a play, and we will save that part of the conversation for when Tony shows up. We were there for 8 years, at which point I left to go off to a theater called the Berkeley Rep, where I spent 33 years. Oskar went off to the Taper, where we ended up co-directing the premiere of Angels in America in 1992. He then went off to become the artistic director of Trinity Rep in Providence, Rhode Island, and then subsequently went to his celestial home, the Public Theater in New York City. It is not an understatement to say that the Public Theater is arguably the most important theater in America in the last 25 years. There's the body of work, the quality of work is unprecedented. The number of programs he has spearheaded from Public Works to the mobile unit, to Joe's Pub, to the Shakespeare in the Park, to the main stage. It has been a cavalcade of Oscar's amazing energy, intelligence, and taste. And I am very proud. And this guy flew out. This guy's fucking busy. And he flew out here for one night to be with us here tonight. And because, for one reason, I made him. And I'm sure I'm going to be working for free at the Public Theater for the next few years because of this. But I just would ask you to join me in welcoming to our stage the one and only Oskar Eustis.
Well, that was silly, Tony. But thank you. Thanks for having me here, guys.
I wanted to sort of begin with, I know that when you came back from Germany, you were supercharged with this idea of being a dramaturg. And I think for me, and for a lot of our colleagues at that time, that was a new word. What was it about dramaturgy and how it functioned in the course of a production that you valued so much?
Well, I didn't get to go to college, and I had an intellectual inferiority chip on my shoulder. And I thought if I came back from Europe and started calling myself a dramaturg, that I would be treated seriously by all you college-educated people. But slightly more seriously, during the years I was in the German-speaking world, I was introduced to the profession of dramaturgy, which is radically different from what we ended up doing here. In the German-speaking world at that time, and still, the dramaturg was primarily the in-house intellectual in the repertory theaters. Since the German repertory theaters primarily did classical repertory, there's some new plays, but they're primarily focused on the classical repertory. There's a tremendous demand for thinking about why you do a certain play when. Why Goethe's Faust now? Why Schiller's Die Räuber now? There's also demand for a lot of research into the historical and literary and cultural background, and also a great desire for programs, which for those of you who spend any time on the continent, German theater programs are sold, they're not free. And my favorite is the boxed set of Goethe's Faust that I got from the Stuttgart Theater, which is a 5-volume program, literally, that you could buy for something like 20 marks. It was subsidized, that consisted of a volume of critical writing, the text with the cut text, so you could read the text that was cut and the text that wasn't, a book of illustrations. I mean, it's just extraordinary. And I met some of the dramaturgs who were, at the time, the most famous, Dieter Sturm, Hermann Beil. They're extraordinary people. And I was just so attracted by the idea of somebody being part of the fabric of the theater whose point was to think that big, to think that broadly. When I came back here, that wasn't really what we did. And so this idea of dramaturg as somebody who worked on new plays, we sort of made up, along with a few other people at the same time. Bob Brustein had just started offering doctorates in it at Yale, so it became real just at that moment. And soon that's what I started doing. I've been doing it for the rest of my life since.
Could you succinctly and briefly tell us what is it you look for in a play?
Sure, it's easy. The thing that attracts me to play is, I'm sure the same thing that attracts all of you. First of all, you look for a voice. And you can't put that exactly into words what that is, but boy, don't you know it when you find it, when you hear a writer and they have a specific individual way of talking, of thinking, of writing. And it's the opposite of what happens most of the time in writers' rooms or films and television. We're not interested in a story that has words that carry it out. We're interested in the idiosyncrasy of an individual writer's way of expressing things. And when you find a voice that you both recognize as individual and feels like it has some truth in it, feels like it has some muscle in it. That's exciting. And then you look for writers who are interested in the things you're interested in, or even better, who are interested in things you didn't know you were interested in, but by the time you finish reading them, you've become interested in. Helen Vendler used to say, that's the mark of a great poet, who takes what they're interested in, and by the end of the poem, have convinced you that it's worth being interested in. And you talked about when we met, Tony, which is exactly accurate. But same thing happened when I heard the first reading that Tony did. I got invited to this reading. He was still a graduate student at NYU. And within 15 minutes of sitting there, I knew he hadn't even laid eyes on me yet. I was just a guy in the audience. I knew it was a moment I'd remember forever, because not only did he have this spectacular individual voice, but I didn't know there was anybody in the American theater who cared about all these things that I cared so passionately about. I'd almost given up, then thinking, okay, all of this stuff that is so important to me politically, intellectually, I'm going to have to drag it in and convince a lot of other. But he was already there. He was already worried to death about the collapse of the Weimar Republic. And what exactly was it with the Communist Party line in 1932 that was so wrong that it led to the rise of fascism? I mean, this was stuff that was bred. I had an odd dinner table growing up, but that was the stuff of our dinner table. And finally, by the time, the first time that Tony heard about me is at the first act intermission of Bright Room. The actors all sang the Internationale, which is the international communist anthem. And backstage at intermission, the actors were saying to Tony, "Who the fuck is that singing along in the audience?" And Tony and I met that night, and it started a friendship that isn't quite as old as our friendship, but certainly as interesting.
Pretty close, pretty close. Can you tell me when you first heard about Tony's first ruminations about angels, and we had done a Bright Room called Day at the Eureka, and we had brought Tony to San Francisco, and for some reason which I cannot recall, we took him to Candlestick Park to watch a baseball game. It's the only baseball game he's ever had to endure in his entire life. I don't know why. Why did we do that?
I had an insight that a gay man from New York coming to San Francisco for the first time, what he wanted to do was see a baseball game.
It's a failed dramaturgical instinct, ladies and gentlemen. So I mean, I really have no recollection why that happened. But we brought him out. We fell in love with his work immediately. There was a kind of visceral, almost cellular reaction on the part of the company, not just you and I, but our actors as well, that this was a voice that was singular and amazing and was speaking to us on a number of levels. And then, so we did Bright Room, which was the first professional production he had ever had. And based on that, we wanted to hire him to write a new play. Do you remember? I remember how I have a version of this, but go ahead. What's your recollection of it?
Well, it actually started before Bright Room was even up. And I want to make it very clear that Angels in America existed because of government funding. At that point, the National Endowment for the Arts still offered grants to individual artists. So we applied for money to commission a play from Tony Kushner, and the federal government gave it to us, $25,000. And in order to apply for this money, we had to have a title. And he said, "I've got a great title." I said, "What is it?" He said, "Angels in America." I said, "What's it about?" I said, "I haven't figured that out yet." So I said, "We have to write something." So we sat for about an hour, and we threw things back and forth. And he said, "I know I want it to be a gay play." So I said, "Put it in the subtitle." I said, "Okay, gay fantasia on national themes." And then he said, and we literally, we had just read a book by Francis Fitzgerald, and so the Mormons ended up in there, and then we had just read the obituary for Roy Cohn, and there was an infuriating obituary that was in The Nation, which was a magazine we basically liked. It was a good progressive magazine. But Robert Scheer, who worked for the LA Times a lot, wrote an obituary that was so ugly in its gloating homophobia about Roy dying of AIDS that it Okay, Roy Cohn's in. And we knew it had to be about AIDS because we were in San Francisco in the middle of this plague. So, we literally sort of threw the kitchen sink into the description and then got the grants. And this kitchen sink of ingredients had to become the play. So it took a few years.
What I remember was these guys pitching me this play, saying, it's going to be a 90-minute chamber piece with Roy Cohn and a couple of Mormons. I was like, sold. Sounds great.
One set.
One set, 90 minutes, three act, going to be great. Short in and out.
But the technical thing, I just forgive me, but I'm a dramaturg, is that Bridegroom was wonderful, but it was a success to esteem, right? It wasn't really a hit. It got very respectful reviews, and it was absolutely clear by the time we were done that Tony had mastered almost all the things you need to be a great writer, but what he had not yet mastered was the reversal. He had not yet mastered dramatic action. And so a typical scene in Bridegroom at that time was two people come on stage in an incredibly intense situation. They express beautifully their thoughts and feelings about the intense situation, and then the scene is over. And so, under my guidance, I actually offered Tony Kushner guidance back then. We reread the poetics, we talked about reversals, we talked about dramatic action, and he got it, that people were going to have to change in his next play. And so he was certain that was true, and it was going to be 90 minutes, and they were going to change. About a year and a half into the process, he came to me and he said, Oscar, I've got a problem. I can't get these people to change. And I, laughed patronizingly, not realizing this was the last time I would ever be able to patronize Tony. I missed those days and said, well, it's your self-indulgence. It's just you're young. You have to learn it. And, explained to him that he needed to just, tighten it up. And he explained to me that, no, he thought the solution was a 2-evening play. And at this point, the only 2-evening play any of us had heard of was Nicholas Nickleby, which was Charles Dickens and the Royal Shakespeare Company, not an unknown gay writer who had a success at esteem. So impossible, I said. And we argued for 2 weeks, and at the end of the 2 weeks, Tony had won the argument, and I've carried his bags ever since. But the key thing that he did, which was, I think, so brilliant, is he took that difficulty, how hard it was to get these people to change, and he made it the subject of the play. And ultimately, that's what inspired the whole play, was how hard it is for people to change, but how utterly necessary it is, because the alternative to changing is dying. And that, by taking that formal difficulty and making it actually the thing that not he, the author, was struggling with, but the thing the characters were struggling with, he unlocked the greatness of that play and his sense of humor. Nobody had ever thought Tony was funny before, and Angels is funny.
It's funny. They're all nodding because they've heard the speech before. Yeah, I heard that. You said that for me. Okay, so Tony's going to come on in a second. Are we ready for Tony? We're all set to go. So after we talk to Tony, there'll be time for you guys to ask questions. This piece of sculpture here is there for that reason. If you would like to ask a question at a certain time, we'll ask you to line up and you can ask your question. Okay. All right. So without any further ado, can you bring in? Can we? There.
Hello.
Hey.
Did it work?
It works.
Tony, can you see us?
I can see you, Oscar. I can
How
see
about-
your very white shoes.
That's me. Tacone's next to me, and a crowd of adoring young and some slightly older people are, I think, out of your sight.
Can we raise the volume level on the TV? Is that possible at all? Anyway, okay, great. Thank you. Hey, Tone, how are you?
Hey, how are you?
Good. We've just been talking about our initial encounter with you as a human being and as a great writer, and then our initial foray into Angels. Can you sort of launch us with a little bit of background about how focused was your writing practice when you embarked upon Angels in America?
Explain what you mean by that.
In
How
other words, I
focused
mean,
it was?
were you feeling that you had a writing practice, like a rigorous way of a habit of writing, or was it something that you got? Because it took 4.5 years to write Angels in America, obviously.
Well, sort of. I mean, we first talked about it, I think, around 1986, 87.
Right.
Because it was after Roy Cohn had actually died, which was 86, I believe. And I think that I wrote Millennium Approaches. So yeah, I guess it was about 3 years, from 87, 88, 89, right? I don't know. It was something like that. And then Perestroika took another couple of years to get a first draft. And then I'm still rewriting Perestroika. Literally. I mean, there'll be a new edition out sometime soon, incorporating changes from recent productions, including Taccone, your production, Professor Taccone, your production at Berkeley Rep. So and I don't know. I mean, I've never been I don't know what a writing practice is. I mean, I'm a writer, and but I'm fairly. I struggle a lot with writing, and as you know, and as Oscar knows better than anybody on earth. And I'm always late with everything, and and Angels was no different. I mean, it took quite a while to figure it out and to get it going. And when we, I mean, I don't know if I'm telling stories that I don't want to get into war stories, but we did the first reading of what would turn into Millennium Approaches. It was the first 2 acts and then a few scenes of Act 3 of Millennium. And there was no discussion at that point of making it into a 2-evening-long play. And in fact, Sigrid Werschmidt, who I wrote the part of the angel for, who died of breast cancer, who was a member of the Eureka Company, after that reading in the green room at the Eureka Theater in '88 or so, was the first person to say to me, well, maybe this has to be 2 evenings long. So it was a fairly shambolic process, I think, up to a point.
Can you talk a little bit about how the idea for the play changed over time in your head? I mean, but it started out as one thing and then morphed, obviously, into something else, or did you have a very clear idea about what you wanted to do, at least in Millennium?
Oh gosh, I don't know. Well, I mean, for one thing, you guys had produced and Oscar had directed Bright Room Called Day, my first play, and
Oops, we're frozen. The joys of technology.
2-hour. My next play was supposed to be 2 hours long, and I said that I wanted to have songs in it, so it was a 2-hour play with songs, and that didn't happen. So that changed a lot. I've said this many, many times, but we applied, I think, with no expectation that we would get it for an NEA grant. Company, what was it called? Like a company.
It was a commissioning grant for you to write for the company.
For a standing company, for a playwright. It was when Carol Churchill and the British, the British were writing plays for a standing company, so Americans got excited about that, and there was an NEA grant. As I remember, the Eureka got about $10,000 or maybe more, and I got $10,000, which was by leagues the most money I'd ever made as a playwright. And it came in the form of a check from the US government with a federal seal on it that said the people of the United States of America. And that was an enormous deal for me. I mean, one of the origins, I think, of the play came from our shared feeling I think maybe more me and Oscar, because Tony, you were more left, sort of crazy radical Maoist stuff at that point. I hope I'm not outing you, but certainly Oscar, we shared for all of our left commie politics, we shared a certain kind of romantic view, and I think Tony, you did too, of a romantic but not necessarily sentimental view of the value of the American democratic experiment and a belief in the radical possibilities of democracy in America, and getting that check and feeling like. And this was during the Reagan years, so we didn't, and we were very honest with the NEA about what this play was going to be about, that it was going to involve Roy Cohn and gay men and all this stuff, and we didn't think we were going to get the check, the commission, and it meant something enormously to me to feel that the play was being paid for by taxpayer dollars, and it was being commissioned in some sense by the American people. So I think that's one of the places when it really apart from my own natural grandiosity, I think it began. I think that's when I stuck the Shavian subtitle, "A Gay Fantasia on National Themes," and I thought, well, if they're going to pay $10,000, I'm going to give them a lot of play, and it's going to be about really big things. So that was partly what it was about. I also think it was the. Apart from our rapidly developing friendship, my great admiration for the two of you and for what the Eureka Theater Company stood for, I mean, which I had heard about before I met Oscar that fateful night on 22nd Street in New York. You know, it was a radical left theater company in San Francisco. I had just come out of the closet. I came out in 1984 at the age of 26, and I was going to get to write a play about being gay. And I think that there was a sort of a liberatory energy that came out of that made the play expand the way that it did. And I think it did change a lot. I mean, it was always supposed to be a play that had the angel appearing midway through it, supposedly at the first hour mark before intermission, and then and it would end up something along the lines of what it ended up with Prior going to heaven and so on. And it was always going to be about several gay men and Roy Cohn. And I kind of ignored the fact that the Eureka Theater Company was 3 straight women and 1 straight man. And it stayed true to those things. But the size of it and the freedom to write as expansively as I had changed the shape of the play and made it grow and grow. And so, does that answer your?
Yeah, that's great. Can you guys describe a little bit your working relationship on the text?
No. Tony, how about you?
Well, I mean, pretty early on, you know, I don't know if this is as true as it used to be, but when we were all kind of coming into our own in theater, the idea of a position of dramaturg had just sort of, a professional dramaturg had finally arrived via Yale School of Drama from European theaters. And the idea that there would be a sort of a paid scholar, script editor, you know, humanist, whatever, in the rehearsal room to sort of guide everybody intellectually was really catching on. But of course, in most American regional theaters, what it meant was that you would show up with your play and you would be told that this complete stranger was going to start telling you how to write the play that you had already written. And it was kind of awful. And there are a lot of playwright horror stories about that. I got really lucky because the first person that I ever worked with in that capacity was Oscar. You know, Oscar's a really, 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 really smart man. And also, we have a great number of shared elective affinities and shared sensibilities. And we come from very different backgrounds, but we see the world in certain ways with a sort of a shared perspective. and an understanding. And we were both excited about the ways that we were different from each other, right? Wouldn't you say that's true, Oscar? And
Absolutely.
and so, starting with Bright Room Cold Day, I immediately knew that this was somebody I wanted to show everything I had ever written and would ever write. I would want to show it to Oscar, and I've learned over the years what Oscar is going to love and what Oscar's probably not going to love, and what Oscar's going to get right away and what Oscar may take a little while to get. But you know, immediately with Bright Room, but then very, very much with Angels, if I worked on the first act, when I worked on the first act of Millennium, or the first two acts of Millennium, and we read them together and read them out loud, Oscar would then explain to me what I had written and what he thought I was trying to achieve. And it was always this kind of miraculous gift. It was like, oh yes, that's right. I work from an outline, but I don't write like, this is going to be a play about X, Y, and Z, because I don't feel that you can do that. You have to discover the deepest content in the process of creating it. So I write a sort of a storyline so that I have something to hang on to and I'm not just out there in the dark alone. But I don't know what it's adding up to. I have intuitions about it, but I sort of try not to analyze it in that sort of overarching sense while I'm working on it, because I try and stay embedded in the particulars. And to have somebody who is immensely articulate and smart and really sensitive to writing, and somebody who really loves writing the way Oscar does, to show the work to, and then have him say, I think this is where you're heading with this, or this is my sense of it, and here's where I think you're really landing it, and here's where you maybe need to keep digging, and here are some ways that, it's just been, I would never have been able to write Angels, or I really think anything else that I've written without this relationship. Well, you don't make that face. What is that face? It's true. You learn very early on. It's true. I think any aspect of human endeavor, we're only as good as the people that we work with and rely on. Just ask Pete Hegseth if that's not true. A little topical humor. God. So I don't know. So it's been, I certainly feel, who knows? My father at my 50th birthday went up to Oscar and said, do you think Tony would have had a career if he hadn't met you? Because that was something my father was worrying about. Who knows what any of us would have been if various things that are important in our lives hadn't happened. I do know that I never feel like like my writing has arrived until I've shown it to Oscar and had a conversation with him about it. And that's things that includes screenplays for Steven Spielberg. It includes whatever I'm writing. It's I don't know, Oscar, how you feel about this, but I feel unable to. It's just you're a part of my work, of my thinking, of the way I see the world, and so and Tony also, our long collaboration. You've directed more of my plays, I think, than anybody else, and your incredible support at Berkeley Rep. Starting with Eureka and our conversations and your enthusiasm. These conversations are what make us into who we are, where we become defined to ourselves as well as in outward sense by the people that we know and love. And, the two of you are my two closest professional relationships and two of my closest personal relationships. So, I'm getting all set. See, it's very late now. It's late in New York, and I'm very old, and I'm jet lagged. So, God knows. And I had an Aperol Spritz at a birthday party before I came here, and I can't drink anymore. So this is not going to go well. So somebody else say something.
Do you want to respond about your dramaturgy with Tony Kushner?
Yeah, that's extremely flattering, Tony. And if you take out all of the excessive praise from me, it's exactly what I feel. We have a conversation. What I think I'm trying to do all the time is understand what you're writing on the deepest level I can and reflect it back to you. That's what I'm trying to do. And when I do that well, I feel like I'm of use. And whether I'm doing it well or badly, it's just an enormous privilege to be able to do that. And the part that, and it's been one of the enormous, I mean, probably the most enormous privilege of my professional life. And the thing that you said that is just so true, and I want to just reiterate for everyone, the gold in a career in the theater, I probably could expand that, a career in the arts, is the relationships that you create. That's the thing that makes this such a fantastic field to be in. It's not the money, it's not the whether it comes or not, it's not the outwards, it's the fact that, you know, and it's true, it is absolutely true, it's among the three of us. This is a huge part of my life when I think of the three of us, and it's made my life so rich and so full and so kind. And the thing I'm trying to reflect back when I read your plays isn't about, that's a good structure, I think. You know, it's trying to understand the wholeness, the gestalt of what you're after. And that's a human activity, right? That's not a technical activity. That's an activity of the soul. And what a privilege to get to do that. And every great theater person I know, Tony, and you are, you know, first and foremost among them, every great theater person I know knows how to find and then keep around them the people who make them better. And that ability to, and it's not just about finding them, it's about keeping them. It's about not dishonoring the relationships that make you better. And I see that all the time. I've seen you do it with actors, Tony. I've watched you form these relationships and then use their brilliance to help fuel what you're writing. And it's again, that's the art form at its most fun.
You can start the lineup if you like, if you have some things to ask. Tony, that leads me to the obvious observation that you've spent a lot of your time writing for particular actors. And can you talk about what that does for you? And are there any times where that becomes a ceiling that is a problem?
Writing for a specific actor?
Yeah, right. Linda Eben, Steven Spadella, you know, these people who are in your imaginative construct and that you have an active dialogue with and who you see the characters through.
Yeah, I mean, I assume this is probably true of most playwrights. Or screenwriters. I love writing for a specific actor. I love actors. We all do. Maybe not, you know, to date or anything, but they're. I mean, actors are strange, but they're unlike playwrights who are completely normal. But I'm in awe. Well, I'm in awe of what directors do as well, and designers as well. But acting is a very peculiar and interesting thing, and you know, a lot of the theater is built around that odd pneuma that actors have. That thing that pneuma is not the right word, but that sort of glow that actors can create, the magic that actors can create. And there are actors, I love actors especially who are great with text. You mentioned Steven Spinella, who I think is probably one of the greatest actors alive in terms of his handling of text. Linda Emond is another one. And when I find somebody like that, I want to write for them over and over and over again. And at the opening night of IHO at the Public, I said to Stephen Spinella, I said, thinking Oscar about what my father had asked you, but I said to Stephen, I can say honestly that I would not have the career that I have, Stephen, if it were not for you, and you would not have the career that you've had were it not for me. I've written a lead role for Stephen in pretty much every play I've written. And, you know, it's just incredibly helpful because you're pulling this whole thing out of the void, this entire world. And if there's a specific actor that you can hear the voice, I know what Stephen Spinella can do, what Linda Emond can do, what other actors, including some really, like actors that have had the great good fortune to work with, like Daniel Day-Lewis or Meryl Streep. You know what they can do? You also have the fun of giving them difficult things to do that they've never tried to do before. I mean, Prior Walter in part came because at the point, I think Stephen wouldn't mind my saying this, at the time that I started working on the play, Stephen was very depressed. He was thinking of leaving theater because he's had a hard time in his career. I didn't want him to leave theater, both because I love Stephen and also for selfish reasons. And he was having a hard time, and he was at that point, he was sort of a difficult person to be around. And I wanted to write him a character who was basically a kind of luminous good person, and sort of out of character for Stephen, because everything I'd written for him before that was edgier and meaner, and I think that's part of where Pryor came from. So, it's Roy Cohn, on the other hand, I didn't write with any actor in mind because I didn't know who would play him. I didn't have anyone in mind. And then lo and behold, Ron Liebman said yes. And I've seen many really great actors play Roy Cohn. I have to say, if I'm honest, I will always hear that voice when I hear Roy, just as I'll probably always hear Stephen's voice when I hear Pryor. Ellen McLaughlin's voice, Sigrid's voice when I hear the angel. So, it's, I've never felt limited by it. I think the scarier thing is if you have an actor that you don't know really well and you're developing a play. I have seen many, many times, and I've had this experience myself, you have to be really careful because an actor's limitations can send the character in somewhat less than ideal, less than felicitous directions. And you then will spend a lot of time, if you keep working on the play, pulling it back in the right direction. I won't go into specifics, but I've had that experience in almost every play I've written. So, but I've never found it to be a hardship to have this group of actors that I rely on and write for.
Hi, I have a question. What tips do you have to playwrights to better support actors that they work with?
To better support them?
Yes.
You mean like financially, like lending them money? Don't lend them money, they'll never pay it back. Explain to me what you mean by support. Support in what way?
I guess sometimes I'll have an actor read a scene, and I guess that the way that I want to work with them, they just don't understand a character the way that I imagined it. And so I want to find times where I want to write for an actor and collaborate to find a happy medium between our two visions. What tips do you have for that?
Well,
Tell 'em what
I
to
mean,
do.
I think that's an interesting question because, first of all, there is the question, and it's a really difficult, complicated question. I don't have an answer for it, of whether or not you should be directing your own writing. I have a master's from NYU in directing, and I'm not a great director, but I'm an okay director, I think. But I I've had the experience many, many times of the kind of frustration that you're talking about, where you know that what's on page, you know that what you've written is not actually being realized. I think there's a great value for a writer, and at least for me personally. I mean, I know a couple. Richard Nelson is a wonderful playwright who can actually direct his own plays. He does it beautifully. Maria Irene Fornes, who was a very great playwright who did astonishing productions of her own plays. Bertolt Brecht was obviously a great director of his own work. Samuel Beckett was a terrible director of his work. His work dies if there. You can see films of productions that Beckett directed with German actors. I forget where they're, but they're online or something, and they're dead. The actors can't get out from under the fact that they're working with one of the greatest writers of all time, and he's there, and it's like so. I think there's a great value in maybe handing the whole thing over to somebody and then driving the director crazy rather than the actors. I torture, as Tony and Oscar will both tell you, I torture my directors hideously. I make them wish that they'd never been born. I sort of consider that to be part of my job. It's maybe good to have that barrier between yourself and the actor, but there's this wonderful thing that Brecht said about Brecht when he was in Hollywood, when he fled from Hitler, and he wound up in Hollywood, and probably one of the two most significant artistic experiences during his time in America was that he did a production of Galileo with Charles Laughton, who was one of the greatest actors that ever lived. And Laughton was, Brecht and Laughton loved each other. Laughton actually did the translation of Galileo from German. And Laughton was the kind of actor that Brecht adored. And he said this great thing about Laughton that he said, Laughton had many ideas for him about how he should improve this play. And Brecht said, of course, all of the ideas were terrible and I didn't follow any of them. But he said, directing Laughton was like leading an elephant through the forest. If you're leading the elephant through the forest and the elephant suddenly stops and says, I can't go any farther, you have no choice. You're not going to make the elephant move. So you have to look around the ground in front of the elephant and see what it is that the elephant's seeing that it doesn't want to step on, and get the ground comfortable for the elephant. And then with luck, the elephant will start to move again. And I think that's a really, I have used that many times in working with actors. I don't know that they're great in making suggestions about, I don't think they have quite the same sensibility as a playwright. So, all actors are different. But when an actor that you trust says, I don't understand this, I don't know why I'm doing this, go back and look at your script. You may have a good answer that will clear it up, but if you don't have one, they'll tell you where the fault lines in your play are as much as any good director or good dramaturg. And I think that's useful. You listen when they say, or if they don't say it, when it's just clear that they're kind of lost, you sort of go, okay, what have I screwed up? What haven't I done that will make this work for them? And it's you'll discover new things about the play in doing it. I do think that it's maybe a good idea for there to be somebody, not just for the playwright, but also for the actors, for there to be somebody else in the room. Because you start the rehearsals, the director and the actors start the rehearsals all in the same place of complete unknowing. Nobody has a clue, no matter how many times they've done Hamlet and blah, 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 blah. They're all at sea. The person who wrote the play has an idea that's deeper and more thorough than anybody else's in the room, because you wrote it. And I forget which critic it was, maybe John Lahr said of Samuel Beckett's direction, that he said it's the dead weight of his authority. It's that you know too much too soon. So they're all going to give in to you and they sort of surrender some. I mean, what both Tony and Oscar can do that I don't do at all, and I don't know how to do this, is why I stopped directing, is to let the actors make mistakes if they're making mistakes long enough so that they actually come to own this thing that they're creating completely, because ultimately they're going to be on stage trying to make it look like, at least in part, it's spontaneous utterance. And to do that, it has to be theirs. They can't have your voice in their head going, no, take that pause. What are you doing? You know, that'll. Although having said that, I worked with the great Deborah Warner, who's one of the great British directors, and Fiona Shaw on Mother Courage. And Deborah Warner stands in the back of the theater while Fiona Shaw is acting and gives these like baseball umpire sort of signals. And Fiona loves it. Other actors hate it, but she does that, and Fiona responds like louder, angrier, whatever. And you know, so there are different ways to do this. But for me, I think it's good to have a director in the room as well. So,
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Jordan. I'm one of the cast members in Angels, and
okay.
it just made me so excited to hear you guys talk about team and building your team. What was the thing for you guys that made you guys come together, or in terms of you finding those actors? What are the things that make that spark for you in building your team? Because I've been so curious about that for me, and like, who do I want around? Who do I want to help grow and build for myself?
You know, it's not complicated in the sense of if you find, I mean, now we're talking within the realm of the theater. If you find somebody whose work you admire, it's like, you literally, that's a good actor. I want to keep watching them act. I want to keep working. That's a good director. That's a writer whose work I admire. Point number one. Point number two, that's somebody who, when I'm working with them, I feel like my game improves. Like it sharpens me. It makes me better. I feel it for whatever set of reasons. You don't have to analyze it. And then point number three, and then we make something together that I'm proud of. And now that, I'm using these broad terms because that happens on a whole multitude of levels, right? It's, as Tony says, elective affinities. It can be emotional, it can be visceral, it can be intellectual, it can be ideological. I mean, a lot between Tony and myself is we shared a lot of the same political beliefs in a world that didn't share a lot of our political beliefs, and that was actually a really strong binding thing. And those political beliefs were not like, oh, this is who we want to vote for. We always disagreed about that. But, you know, about the idea that the private appropriation of wealth that was created by a group was wrong. That's a big idea. It's a political idea, but it's a big idea about how you approach the world. And then the hard part, all of those things are things that happen on every show, right? Every show, something goes on. You like, the hard part is then hanging on to it. Because in this profession and in this culture, they're constantly trying to separate you out. And particularly when you're successful, they want to separate you out and say, yeah, it wasn't them, it was you. You were fantastic. Yeah, your friends are okay. But come here, let me make you. And in a million different ways, it's what the culture does to destroy the thing that this is a crude example. Tony, don't correct me. But this is a very crude example. Arthur Miller, incredible player, writes 2 stunning plays about lower and then middle class American families and their paterfamilias struggling, All My Sons and Death of a Salesman, struggling to make it for their families, and America falls in love with these. They're extraordinary. Miller becomes incredibly famous and successful and wealthy and marries Marilyn Monroe, and we wonder why his later work doesn't seem to speak to us as much. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Celebrity is a class in America, and that's the way that America neutralizes so many great artists, is it puts them in that class where they become courtiers. Don't let that happen to you. Don't disrespect the people you love. That Stephen Spinella and Lynn Eman, you heard this guy talk. These are not movie stars. These are great actors. They've done some great stuff, but Tony's not hanging on to them because they're famous. He's hanging on to them because of the artistry in the relationship. And that, in my experience, that's the toughest thing. How do you hang on to the valuable relationships that you form? And if you do that, what you find out is the hardest thing about being an artist. You hang on to those people, and then you find that you're becoming more and more yourself as you get older. You're not fraying around the edges and becoming less specific. As you grow up, you're becoming more and more a specific artist. And you think about the artists that you admire and the artists you love who are really old like us. And you know what? They're artists who became more themselves. They're not people who sort of got more general. They're people who became odder and more specific. That's true always in what I'm looking for when I'm looking for people.
I'll always remember
Now-
that. Thank you.
Now can I yell at you about Arthur Miller?
He's been patiently just sitting on his hands the whole time. Sure, go ahead.
Yeah, well, it's off topic. I mean, boo! I think Arthur, I revere Arthur Miller, and I think everything Oscar said, I completely agree with. I will say, I think he held out longer than you're giving him. I mean, View from the Bridge, and The Crucible, and The Price, and everybody has so many melodies inside of them, and then eventually you kind of maybe run out. But I think that Oscar's point, apart from him defaming Arthur Miller, is really completely correct. I think that when we were coming of age in the theater, we all shared, even before we met, we'd all read about Brecht in Berlin, East Berlin, and the Berliner Ensemble, and the productions. Oscar speaks German, but we all loved Brecht because we all were interested in Marxism theory and practice, and also in Brecht as one of the century's greatest artists, and this theater ensemble that came together, including his wife Helena Weigel, who created the role of Mother Courage and is arguably one of the great actors of all time. We also, in the Bay Area, there was the San Francisco Mime Troupe. On the East Coast, there was the Wooster Group and the Mabu Mines. There were a lot of ensembles at that point, and there are still today. There, Elevator Repair and so on. There's an idea of collective creation, which goes all the way back to Shakespeare. I mean, you think about the King's Men and the Lord Chamberlain's Men. That theater is, as Oscar has said many, many times, fundamentally a collective enterprise. And so our anger and our rejection of this kind of psychotic individualism that was the sort of one of the ideological cornerstones of the Reagan counter-revolution that has brought us to the doorstep of American fascism today. We hated that idea, and we saw in theater practice a way of repudiating it, that we could all get together and collectively create something that really couldn't be attributed to a single person. So I think it's what Oscar said a few minutes ago. You find the people and you hold on to them. You respect that. And the one way to respect it is to acknowledge that you are not complete in and of yourself. It's the thing I ended the essay that ends every edition of Perestroika, where I talk about my collaborations, with the quote from Marx that the smallest unit of humanity is not one person but two. There is no one person. Everybody is born in a social context and exists in his, her, or their relations to other people. And everything else that suggests that we can be entirely replete unto ourselves is a pernicious lie. It's a fiction.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Jordan.
Hi, I'm Dia. I'm very starstruck right now. I was wondering, how, as a writer, do you know when you're done with something? Because so I'm an acting major with an English minor, And all my life, I've tried to write things, and I don't know when to be done. and I was wondering, I mean, your play is incredible, and it even though there are multiple parts, each section is complete, and I feel, at least I feel like you said exactly what needed to be said. So how do you know when you're done talking?
I think that's one of the hardest things about being a writer is to know when it's time to say this is finished. And if I do anything more to it, when I was a student at Columbia University in the 1970s, I took a class in American poetry with the wonderful poet Kenneth Koch, and he started the class out by showing us the 1847 edition of Leaves of Grass, the first time Song of Myself had ever appeared, and then the next edition, which was, I think, 1851. And in the 1847 edition, I think I have the dates right, Whitman starts out, I celebrate myself in what I shall assume you shall assume, for every atom belonging to me as well belongs to you. And in the second edition, the next time he put out Leaves of Grass, Song of Myself began, I celebrate myself and sing myself, and every atom belonging to me is what good belongs to you. And Koch said, so let's look at the difference between the two. And he says, in terms of the Song of Myself being the sort of the great sort of foundational poem of the American democratic spirit, the great utterance of that, at any rate. Celebrating is something that everyone can do. It's not a skill. Not everybody can sing, or at least not everybody thinks they can sing. So Whitman immediately introduced something that a little bit takes away some of the unbelievable force of those opening lines. I celebrate myself and what I shall assume, you shall assume. It's to take the myself and say, and it's me. It's a sort of a generous narcissism as opposed to malignant narcissism, which we all have so much fun watching in action today. But he in the second edition he changes it and he says, I celebrate myself and sing myself. So he's already starting. Ego is beginning to creep in to this poem that has this thing that is sort of an egoless ego. It's like his ego is all of our, is the myself is all of us. It's so democratic. And Koch said, so, in other words, if you want to write, you should take this to heart. It's very easy to ruin what you've written. And Horace, the Roman poet Horace, in the, I can't remember which epistle it is, but in one of his big epistolatory poems, which has the section that we now call Ars Poetica, which if you haven't read, you must read. It's like the greatest thing any writer ever wrote about writing. And he says in the middle of it, among other terrifying things, he says, if you rewrite too much, you could ruin what you've written. And yet, if you don't rewrite, what you're trying to write will probably never arrive. And so it's an intuition. I don't know, I know that, and we knew, when I wrote at the end of the work that we were doing on Millennium Approaches, Oscar, maybe you remember more clearly than I do, but there were a couple of things that we had to cut out that Oscar said we just don't have. If we remove these, this last act will have an incredible shape. I don't remember, Oscar. One of them was like maybe a Hannah and Josie. I don't know. Anyway, there was something that we cut out. Do you remember?
Yeah, well, there's a Hannah Harper scene.
Yes. Right, that's what it was.
We also combined two of the dead prior scenes.
Yes, right. And we sat down in one of the most memorable dramaturgical sessions at the Taper 2, and we worked out the beats of the angel's arrival. And every director that's ever done this play that doesn't do exactly what we set down in that, it doesn't work as well. It has this, everything that we set down, if you do that, it has a power that it doesn't have if you try and short chain anyway. So we worked through that, and then there was one scene, Act 2, Scene 7, with Lewis and Joe in the courthouse steps. And Oscar was in LA directing Julius Caesar, and I was in the Eureka working on Millennium Approaches. And suddenly one day, I realized, we knew that that scene was the most important scene in the play in a way, that there was something that was supposed to be happening there and it wasn't happening. And then I realized that the problem was that I couldn't get Lewis to shut up and I couldn't get Joe to start talking. I had one character who was just a logorrheic like me, and the other was this guy who found it very difficult to say anything. And I needed to get Lewis to shut up and let Joe talk. And the minute that happened, I called Oscar and I said, I think I fixed it. And I sent him the scene and he wrote back and said, you fixed it, it's done. And at that moment, we thought the play was done. The Millennium was done. And maybe
It was even more specific than that. The speech that Joe makes about the courthouse being empty used to be Lewis's speech. You literally,
no, was it?
you
No.
picked up that speech and you gave it to Joe, and if you look at it, it sounds a little bit like Lewis. And so what happened was you'd actually manifested Lewis's influence on Joe by having Joe sound a little bit like Lewis. It was brilliant. It was brilliant.
Well, yes, in the sense that, yes. But Lewis didn't describe it as a dream of showing up early, showing up at the courthouse, and Joe is so disoriented that he thinks it's Monday.
We're in the
but it's
weeds
actually-
here, guys. We're in the weeds.
Okay, sorry.
Later.
All right. But so I knew Millennium was done at that point. With Perestroika, I also knew that Perestroika was one of those plays that was never going to be finished. There's a thing that Goethe says about some of his plays that he called them his incommensurables, meaning the parts are, I think what he means is that there's something in the play that will always resist equilibrium. It'll always be a little bit out of balance. And that actually is a good thing because although the play will never be as neat a contraption as a play that isn't like that. I mean, Millennium is a pretty neat contraption. Perestroika has this kind of open-endedness that gives it its own sort of strange power. So I'm pretty happy to change Perestroika every time I have the time to do it, and I leave Millennium alone.
You can take heart in Samuel Beckett's adage, works of art are never finished, they're abandoned.
When do you abandon them?
Thank you.
Thanks. 2 more questions and then we'll wrap it up.
Hi, I'm Jason, one of the semi-old people in the crowd. I'm an SC alum, and but first, thank you very much for Angels in America. I first watched it when in my early 20s, and I was a FOB, engineering major, closeted. It really left a mark and impact on my life. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And I like writing, but as a very amateur, I'd like to ask you writers, how do you keep your work authentic, reflective, but not hurting people or friends that really love and care about you? Since Tony mentioned, we have to keep those kind of people in our life, especially at times like this. Thank you.
I mean, I think it's probably difficult. You know, I'm not somebody who particularly set out to injure or hurt anyone with my writing, but when you write, I mean, your only real job, I think you shouldn't worry too much about things like authentic and honest. Your real job is to sort of try as hard as you can to get at something that feels like the truth, which is very difficult. And you realize early on, I mean, in fact, even if you're not a writer, you realize it, you should have realized it, unless you're a Republican, that the greatest enemy to the truth that you face is probably inside you. There are so many reasons why the truth is dangerous, why saying certain things is risky, can be feel like you're really endangering yourself or some part of yourself, or that you're going to do injury to other people. And I believe that you shouldn't. I think that there are times when you can make a decision not to say certain things because you feel that to say them at a certain moment in history might mean that your work will be used by the wrong sort of people and disadvantageous to the right sort of people, the people that you want to be in solidarity with. And of course, there are times when you want to write something and you think, but the person that I love, or somebody that I love, or even somebody that I don't love that much, but I don't really want to do terrible injury to, might read it and be hurt. And I think it's legitimate at that point to say, I'm not going to do it. On the other hand, I think that writing has a weird power. It's an indirect power, but it's a power in the world. And I don't think it's possible. I think that it's. I like to believe that there's a difference between causing emotional distress because of recognition, as opposed to causing emotional distress because that's the goal, is to inflict injury. I think if you're writing to try and explore why, I mean, one of my favorite quotes from Auden, the job, he says, this is in his elegy to William Butler Yeats, sing of human unsuccess in a rapture of distress. It's to, if we really want to get it, why life is so hard and why over and over again the human project winds up in these terrifyingly difficult places, and why humanity does nothing as regularly and unrelentingly and reliably as betraying itself, betraying its humanity. To really get at some of those things is going to be painful to you, and it's going to cost you. If it doesn't cost anything, you're probably not doing anything worth. It's not. Why do it then? I mean, we go to the theater to watch Medea murder her children. We've been doing that for 2,500 years. It's a hideous thing that we even want to see that. Why do we want to see that? Why do we want to see some poor actress go through that night after night, and actually only want to see an actress who's really going through that? We're very dark, complicated creatures, and I think, that's just, I don't know, maybe you guys have something that you want to say about that, but I think it's...
Oscar, as somebody who deals with a lot of new writers, is this fear of hurting others, is that something that you're seeing a lot of these days?
It's totally real. But I think of Eugene O'Neill, who wrote Long Day's Journey into Night, which is a complete romantic laugh. It's completely autobiographical about his family. He wrote it in 1941. He left instructions that it was not to be released until 25 years after his death. And his widow, Carlotta, released it 2 years after his death. And it was done in Sweden, and then the year after done at Circle in the Square in New York. And I believe she did exactly the right thing, because his statement that it wasn't to be released until 25 years after his death, I think, was not an instruction to the world. It was the way he gave himself permission to be completely honest in writing it. I don't think he could have written it if he didn't think to himself, it's not going to be seen by anybody for a long time. I think once he's dead, he didn't care, and the whole rest of his family was dead. And it's next to Angels, it's the greatest American play. So I think, he made a face, didn't he?
Well, you made a face when I said something nice about you, so there we go.
I just can't
And
see
by the
you.
way, he not only said that it couldn't be performed until 25 years, he said it couldn't be read until 25 years after his death. He said in his will that it should never be performed on stage. It should only be read. He was that afraid of seeing these people on there. Can I tell you one other cool thing? Did I tell you this that I just realized? You know Ingmar Bergman's film, The Seventh Seal? The guy who plays Death in The Seventh Seal directed the first production ever of Long Day's Journey into Night at the Royal Dramat in Sweden. It was directed by Death.
So you have to be a human being as well as a writer. So you get to make choices as a human being that are not identical to what you do as a writer.
Thank you for the insight.
Okay, our last question of the evening.
I'm Sanjay Sharma. I teach at the Marshall School of Business and a course called Stardom at the Drama School. I am starstruck because I saw the play when it came out in New York. I have three related questions. One is, Tony, you have worked both in theater, in plays and screenwriting. What is the perspective that you can give to the audience? The differences from your side. The second is, do you like watching Angels in America on screen or in theater? And the third question, which is related to this, is that there is an evolving medium now, and I studied that, is that, there was this show on Netflix, Adolescence, which is one take, just like the Birdman movie. Do you think that the medium is kind of blending, where you will have so much opportunity as equipment gets lighter and lighter, more portable, to shoot plays for the streaming audience in one take? So does it add to it or subtract to it?
Okay, there's a lot there, Tony. You want to
Yeah.
parse that out?
Yeah, I thought Adolescence was astonishing. And the one take thing is, have you ever seen the movie Russian Ark?
Yes.
It's this astonishing thing. It's an entire film. It's sort of the history of Russia from about the 15th century to modern day, through watching this French aristocrat walk through the Hermitage. It's just an amazing thing. It's all in one take. I mean, it's, and I think the way they use it in Adolescence is shattering and incredibly effective. And I don't see how they got that boy to do what he does in that. I mean, that's really just beyond belief. There's so much in your questions. It's, I mean, the easiest thing to say, I used to say this all the time before I ever wrote a screenplay, and then I started writing screenplays, and it turns out to some extent I was right. A lot of it has to do with property relations and ownership. When I write a screenplay, I don't own it. And I'm aware of that. It's not, the words are mine, but they're actually literally owned by the studio. When I write a play, it's mine. I have the copyright. You can rent it from me, but if I don't like what you're doing, I've only once in my entire career called a producer up and said, I'm gonna pull the rights. And it was to Oscar when he was doing the production of my play, The Intelligent Homosexual's Guide, which is dedicated to his mother and his stepfather. There was an actor who was putting a pause in that I thought ruined one of the most important moments in the play. But I think I really did this just because I wanted to see what it would feel like to call a producer up and say, if he does that pause one more time, I'm pulling the play. I didn't do it. And I think Oscar knew that I wasn't going to do it. But it does make a difference. There's a tremendous weight of responsibility on a playwright that is slightly different, I think, than the responsibility on a screenwriter. As I said earlier, when everybody gets into that room together, especially if it's a new play, the only solid thing in the room is the script on the table. And you've created that. And you've made this roadmap for all these people to start to come together and do the work that they need to do. And and you have sort of the owner's power over it, but you've also gone in ahead of other people. You know, and the traditions of theater, I mean, are that this thing is the Bible, and you're gonna like, actors are gonna find their own version of everything that you've done, and directors will find that, and designers, but the best designers and actors and directors are gonna constantly check back in with the Bible and say, does this have any relationship to this text? And that's a huge weight of responsibility, and it also, and I think maybe because of the weight of that responsibility, it pulls out a lot of stuff from you. You really are, I feel as a playwright, you're very much aware of it. When you're writing a screenplay, to some degree, you try and write your best, and some screenwriters are as good as any playwrights. But in a certain sense, you're writing a kind of a suggestion to the director of what you'd like the movie to be, and then the director is going to take it and you sit there with everybody else and keep your fingers crossed and hope that depending on the power relationships in the studio. I mean, I work only at this point with Steven Spielberg. He runs everything. So it's a very nice position for me because we get along great, and he really respects me and I really respect him, and we argue. I can yell and scream at him and he doesn't fire me. And finally the decisions will be his, but I know he's at least heard me about everything. And I also think Steven's kind of a genius. So often, I'm wrong about these things and he's right. And even when I'm right and he's not right, the movie comes out right, But it's a very different thing. It feels, in a certain sense, a little bit secondary. I'm sure that there are screenwriters who have worked with directors and they feel, and you can see some movies where you think the screenwriter deserves a lot more credit than he, she, or they are getting. But it's a very different relationship. There are other things too. I do believe that theater is more of a dialectical art form than a narrative art form. It's great to have a good story, but it's not fundamentally ever about the story. And I've said this a million times. What theater does that film can't do, because of its absolute resistance to the commodity form, any night performance on any given night is only ever happening, it exists at that moment and then it's gone. And it will never be recreated even the next night. It'll be a different audience, different things will have happened in the world, and the event will have changed. So it fundamentally cannot be commodified. The script can be, reputations maybe can be, since you teach a course about stardom, I'm sure you talk about that. But the thing itself on the stage in front of you that you're collaborating in the audience by making, that happens once and everybody's aware of it. It makes it very uncomfortable. It's so much easier to watch a thing on TV or to watch a movie, even if it's a really upsetting movie, because it's not going to change by anything you do or feel. It's a commodity, it's a form, it's an object. And theater is designed to be only partially successful at creating illusion. You believe it and you don't believe it at the same time. And that teaches you critical consciousness. That's how, the only way that people who are sane can get through the world is by knowing that everything is what it seems to be and also is not what it seems to be. And you can't be a fundamentalist. Film is so overwhelmingly great at creating illusion that the challenge is always to really fight your way back to skepticism. I mean, unless the director is working with you to do that, but the traditions in film are so entirely illusionistic. And theater can't, it just, no matter how hard you try, at the end of Hamlet, Laertes and Hamlet are lying on the stage, they've just had a sword fight and they're going, and Shakespeare never did anything that he didn't understand completely. He knew that those bodies were going to be breathing, and that's what, that you're supposed to deal with that. And I love that about theater, and it is the only art form I think that really has that I mean, every other art form has a version of it. Painting certainly does, but that's why we have it. It's you know, stories are great, and we all, you know, we love stories, but it's more an incarnated argument in front of us. We do watch Medea murder her children because we want to see somebody murder their children, maybe so that we don't have to murder ours. But we also want to see the dialectic underneath it about gender, about love, about hate, about war, about rationality versus the rational versus the irrational. I mean, all the things that are in Euripides' play. And we're there having that argument with the actors and with each other when we're watching it. So I think it's just a very, there are many ways in which these forms are similar. Right now, I'm trying to write a mini series. I thought I can do this. I'm writing 2, and I thought this will be easy for me because Angels in America is a mini series. It's 8 acts. All of them are about an hour long, so they're episode length. And I thought I can do this. I'm learning now that for television, I have to give up something that I've taught myself over years of being a playwright, that a scene has to be a kind of complete drama in and of itself. It has to have a sort of an arc, a dramatic action has to take place, reversals and so on. I think I'm beginning to understand that in an episode of television, there's an arc that includes many short episodes that will add up to a completed action. But if you try and make each scene a kind of dramatic scene, you're going to wind up with very limited amount of narrative ground that you can cover, and the expectation is that you cover a lot of narrative ground. So it's a different form, and I have great respect for all other forms, but theater does what it does, and it's the reason it'll never go away, and we have to have it. And I think it's interesting to me how even in this age of the digital revolution, people will still return to the stage as a metaphor for human consciousness. I mean, Oscar has said this many times, at some point in the Hellenic world, or maybe even earlier than that, we reproduced in some weird way the way human consciousness works outside of ourselves on this in this arena. And the minute that happened, it became central to our way of understanding the world, and I think it remains that to this day. So.
Any final word, Oscar?
I don't think I want to follow Tony. That was brilliant, Tony. Thank you. Actually, the one thing I'd say is just the simple version of one of Tony's points, which is it's the presence of the audience that makes it utterly different from any digital media. And to me, the presence of the audience, the fact that we're breathing the same air in the same room, it's what Tony refers to as the singularity of what happens in theater, that makes it an utterly different event. And David Hare wrote a play about the rise of the National Front in the 1970s. David Edgar, which was the neo-Nazi movement in England. And it played on the West End for 8 months, and it played one night on BBC Two, and in that one night, it reached something like 100 times as many people as it reached on the West End. And somebody asked him which was more important, and he said, well, the stage version, of course. And the reporter said to him, but Mr. Edgar, it reached 100 times as many people on television. He said, yes, but it reached them at their most reactionary moment, when they're at home alone on their couch. And that just rang so true to me, that you change in a different way when you're in a room full of people.
Okay, that's a great way to wrap it up. You want to say anything?
One quick comment, very
Okay.
quick comment.
Okay.
Hello, I'm a Greek actress. I have played Medea, but I have played also Angel in Angels in America in Greece.
Yay!
So
There you
I
go.
just want to say hi and thank you so much
Hi.
for this amazing theatrical play. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you all. Thank you all for coming out tonight. I think any of you who were wondering about as to the spectrum and brilliance of the ideas of where Angels in America came from, that has been answered for you tonight. I want to thank these two extraordinary guys for showing up. Amazing. Thank you, Tony. Thank you, Oscar.
Thank
Amazing.
you, guys. This is fun.
Bye. You can leave the Zoom meeting now.
Thank you.